When you create a business solution using Excel macros, you gain the ability to influence your users' actions. For example, you can display a welcome message when the workbook opens, verify a workbook's integrity before it's closed, and examine the workbook's contents before it's saved. Each of these event handling routines help ensure your workbook will function the way you want it to. For example, let's say that I wanted to display a welcome message whenever a workbook is opened. If I were to open the Manipulate workbook, Excel displays a message saying, "Welcome to the Commission Tracking Workbook." I'll click OK, and then press Alt F11 to go to my code module so that you can see how I did that. The auto open event, or macro, is actually a holdover from Excel 4, which used a different macro language. But so many programmers used it that the Excel product team kept it in. Notice that unlike other event handlers, the auto open subroutine actually is in a general module, as opposed to either Sheet 1 or, because this is a workbook module, this workbook. It's just a peculiarity of the auto open subroutine. Also notice that I've used the private keyword in front of the subroutine call. That means that other workbooks won't be able to see it when they open. So what are some other events that you can use? Well, another good one is before close. And that one does need to go into the This Workbook code module. I've commented out the code for before close, just so I could work with the workbook, close it, and save it without worrying about changing it. Now I will remove the comments just by deleting the single quote mark and then copying and pasting and removing the quotes. What this macro does is whenever a user tries to close the workbook before close event fires. And it has a single argument, which is cancel as Boolean. That means that it is possible for you to cancel this operation in your VBA code. And in fact, we'll do that if a certain condition is met. In this example, I've created a workbook where I assume that an individual, whoever's using the workbook, will need to enter a value into cell F5. If we go back to the main workbook, you see that that is the commission rate for these sales. So going back, that means that if the cell is blank, I will require the user to enter a commission rate in cell F5 before closing the workbook. I then set cancel equal to true, which I can do because cancel is a Boolean. I end the if statement, and then I end the event handler. Because I'm assigning the value true to cancel, that means that Excel will not allow the workbook to close. Let me show you what that looks like. Alt F11, I'm here, and I will attempt to close the workbook. When I do, it says, please enter a commission rate in cell F5 before closing the workbook, and all they can do is click OK. Now if I enter a rate of, say, 0.05, and hit enter, and try to close the workbook, I get the usual message box asking if I want to save the changes that I made. If I say no, now I can close the workbook. And I will open it back up. Welcome back. You can also create a code module using the before save event. And I'll show you what that code looks like. Again, it goes in this workbook. This one looks a little bit more complicated, but you don't need to worry about these variables here. As long as you're using workbook before save, all you need to do is memorize or simply cut and paste these values here. So you don't need to worry too much about them at this point. This time, if a user tries to save the workbook, Excel displays a message box asking, do you really want to save the workbook? And it displays a VB yes no message box. If the answer is no, again, if you click the no button in a VB yes no message box, then Excel returns the value VB no, then cancel equals true. And once again, because cancel is a Boolean up here, canceling will cause the workbook not to save. So let's go back to the body of the workbook and attempt to save it. When I do, Excel asks if I really want to save the workbook. I don't, so I'll say no. When I click no, Excel does not save the workbook. The available workbook events let you run a subroutine just after a user opens a workbook or attempts to close or save a workbook. For example, you could have a subroutine that reminds a user if there's no data entered into a required cell before closing the workbook or before saving the workbook.